Hey everyone, welcome back to POL SCI 701, Techniques of Political Science Research. This week we're going to talk about uncertainty. So up to this point, in all the previous weeks, we talked about different techniques to extract useful information from different types of data, right? We started with causal inference and comparing treatment and control groups to make to assess treatment effects or effects of specific interventions. We talked about measuring other quantities of interest based on survey data, for example, and talked a lot about election surveys and predicting vote choice. We talked about other predictions based on our linear regression models, and we talked about discovering patterns in other types of unstructured data like textual data. Okay, and one of the questions that we always kind of came back to was how certain can we really be that our empirical findings actually tell us something systematic about the underlying population of interest, or to what extent they might just be due to chance, right? So, for example, when we talked about analyzing randomized controlled trials, we found average differences between treatment group and control group, for example, in the turnout study, but given the size, we were wondering to what extent this is kind of reflecting a true kind of treatment effect, or to what extent this might just be due to chance, maybe because there's some imbalance between the treatment group and the control group, right? Um, so in order to be able to tell whether the observed differences result from chance or whether they're actually large enough for us to conclude that there are that there is a true treatment effect that we're interested in, we need to explore. Essentially, what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to separate kind of the signal from the noise, right? We need to be able to assess whether a difference that we observe is large enough to where we can say, okay, this is truly not a random difference, but it's actually systematic, right? It's actually something that is reflective in the overall population, right? And so, in order to be able to do that, we need to be able to quantify the degree of uncertainty in our point estimates, in any of the point estimates that we talked about in all these past weeks, right? So in the previous week, we started kind of looking into the laws of probability and probability theory in general, and now we're going to apply these laws and these rules to introduce the kind of measures of uncertainty around the point estimates that we talked about before, right? Specifically, oops, let's see. Specifically, in this week, we're going to talk about three different topics. First, we're going to talk about estimation and uncertainty in surveys. Okay, so this will go back to some of the examples that we talked about in past weeks, where we talked about election predictions and election polls, and we'll talk about how we can quantify the uncertainty around those estimates. And then we will move on to estimation and uncertainty in experiments. Again, we'll revisit some of the examples that we've seen in previous weeks, but now we will talk about how we can quantify the uncertainty around the estimates that we've already seen. Okay. And then in the last video, I'm going to talk briefly about inference with normally distributed data. And just briefly, while kind of the previous videos or the first and second video will focus on kind of quantifying uncertainty based on the central limit theorem, which we introduced last week, we can also make inferences about uncertainty without invoking the central limit theorem, as long as the data that we're looking at are normally distributed. And I'll talk more about that in the last video, right? So overall, we'll cover important topics like sampling distribution, consistency, and unbiasedness, which we already talked about a little bit when we introduced OLS. We'll derive or talk about how we can compute standard errors for our estimates, like differences in means, talk about confidence intervals, and of course margin of error in surveys. Okay. So let's move to the to-do list for this week. So before our next Q&A session, which is on Monday, Please go through the lecture videos as always, and then read in our quantitative social science book, chapter 7.1. So I should have mentioned this right from the start. As you can see in the syllabus, we will split up the uncertainty topic into two parts. One, the first part that we're going to talk about here, and then in the second part we will in the following week we'll discuss the remaining chapters, so 7.3 to 7.4, I believe, to talk about specifically uncertainty with regression, and we'll talk about hypothesis testing. Right here, we're going to talk more about the basics of how do we compute confidence intervals, how do we think about sampling distributions, and so on. Right. So for now, for this week, you only have to read the first part of that chapter, and the remaining parts for the next week. Okay. As always, there's a little bit of code this week as well, and so please, as you go through these videos, make sure to check out the project in RStudio Cloud and follow the code as I go through these videos. And I will get to this later on in the videos, but especially when we talk about interpreting confidence intervals and interpreting kind of the idea of the sampling distribution, I'll show a couple of simulations here on the slides, but I will also link some additional visualizations on Canvas where you can kind of play around with different sampling distributions and look at different confidence intervals and their properties. Okay, so make sure to check out that information on Canvas as well, and I'll mention it in the videos again as well. And then lastly, you have to, of course, work on assignment 10, which is posted on Canvas and RStudio Cloud. And given that it's Thanksgiving next week, I pushed the due date for this assignment further back. So it'll be due on December 1st, which is Tuesday after our next Q&A session. So not this upcoming Q&A session, but the Q&A session after that. So you'll have the entire weekend and Monday to work on that assignment. You have a little bit more time, so you can also take some days off over the Thanksgiving break and don't have to kind of rush to get the assignment ready by then. Accordingly, we'll push the remaining assignments back. We'll kind of continue then with assignments due the Tuesday after that Tuesday again, right? So we're kind of back to the regular schedule, and you'll have a little bit more time this week to work on the first assignment covering uncertainty. All right, that's all for the overview for now. In the next video, I'm going to talk about estimation and uncertainty in surveys.